At 11 a.m. on the 3rd of September 1939, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced that a state of war existed between Germany and Great Britain. That evening, the Donaldson liner SS Athenia sailed 250 miles northwest of the Irish coast on her normal routine passage from Glasgow to Montreal. She was carrying 1,103 passengers and a crew of 305. Amongst her passengers were 300 Americans, as well as over 100 children. At 7:30 p.m., her port side exploded. Athenia immediately listed to port and began to settle by the stern. Although she remained afloat for several hours before she finally sank, 118 passengers and crew were killed, including 28 Americans. The Athenia had been sunk by a U-30 commanded by Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp. It was an unprecedented act of naval aggression. The Battle of the Atlantic and the war against the U-boats had begun. From the Middle Ages, Britain depended on overseas trade for her wealth and prosperity. She established and expanded an overseas empire whose role was to supply raw materials and act as a market for British manufactured goods. But Britain had become more and more vulnerable to interruptions to that trade. Almost half the world's ocean-going merchant shipping flew the Red Ensign. British shipyards built 40% of the world's merchant ships, and the Royal Navy made protecting Britain's trade vessels one of its top priorities. Needless to say, Britain's enemies recognized that interrupting her trade would have disastrous consequences. Between 1914 and 1918, Germany pursued a submarine campaign against the United Kingdom that nearly brought Britain to her knees. In April 1917, the Germans sank almost 900,000 tons of Allied shipping, virtually all of which was by submarine. It was a catastrophic loss, reducing the British stock of essential war supplies down to a mere 6 weeks. Yet the submarines involved were small, fragile, and unreliable. The first German submarine, the U-1, had only been completed at the end of 1906. And the first operational U-boat, armed with a single torpedo tube, had managed to complete a 600-mile cruise around German waters in 1908. To the British, the idea of a submarine was looked on as ignoble and underhand. In 1914, Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, dismissed the possibility of a submarine campaign targeting Britain's trade. "I do not believe that this would ever be undertaken by a civilized power," he said. Lusitania was on a normal liner voyage from New York to Liverpool when, as she approached Queenstown on the Irish coast, she was hit by a torpedo fired from a U-20. She sank rapidly, taking almost 2,000 passengers with her, most of whom were women and children. Over 100 were Americans. The Germans quickly tried to justify the act by claiming that the Lusitania was carrying war supplies. Although there was a shred of truth to such claims, the loss of so much innocent life could not be justified. The loss of the Lusitania raised the curtain on unrestricted submarine warfare. All enemy vessels became legitimate targets and could be attacked without warning. Gradually, the British Admiralty began to realize that the submarine could completely change maritime warfare. German submarines started to seriously weaken British and Allied shipping, and the defenders had little with which to fight back. Tactics like Q-ships, where warships were disguised as merchant ships, simply forced the German submarines to attack while still submerged. Only the reluctant introduction of the convoy system late in the war led to a decline in the numbers of lost merchant ships. By the end of the First World War, almost 5,000 British merchant ships were sunk by submarines. Nearly 15,500 merchant sailors were lost. At the same time, 178 German submarines were sunk, killing over 6,000 German sailors. But they had brought Britain perilously close to defeat. It was a salutary lesson on the potential of the submarine as a devastating weapon. This lesson was lost neither on the British nor on those surviving German naval officers who would later spearhead the naval forces in the Second World War. The Treaty of Versailles placed strict limits on the size and the composition of the German armed forces. One of these limits imposed a total ban on the construction or operation of submarines. But Germany had entered the First World War as submarine novices and emerged from it as experts. Small as it was, the German Navy was not about to throw away its huge advantage in an area of warfare that would prove critical in any future conflict. The result was a remarkable conspiracy by German naval officers and shipbuilders, in which a web of intrigue was created to mask the fact that Germany was determined to build on its expertise in submarine warfare. As early as 1920, a new underwater warfare section was established within the Torpedo and Mines Inspectorate at Kiel. At the same time, German shipbuilders could still offer help and advice to countries such as Japan, Argentina, Italy, and Sweden. This ingenious plan ensured that German skills were not lost and were kept up to date with new technological developments. Germany even tried to establish submarine building yards in Holland and Spain. These plans were soon shelved, though, after pressure from the international community. Other complicated cover organizations were established to make it virtually impossible for Allied monitors, set up under the League of Nations, to keep accurate records of what the Germans were really up to. By the early 1930s, German-designed submarines were under construction in Holland, Spain, Estonia, and Finland for a variety of customers. Strangely enough, every submarine looked remarkably similar to the most successful German U-boat designs of the First World War. When Adolf Hitler took power in 1932, rearmament took on a new importance. Hitler was determined to remove the restrictions that had been imposed at Versailles as soon as he could, by legal means or not. By the autumn of 1933, an official submarine school was established at Kiel, and 80 officers were hand-picked to become its first students. At the same time, U-boat parts and sections began to be imported into Germany from the German-sponsored submarine yards in Holland. By 1935, Hitler was proposing a new German navy that was to include a submarine force nearly half the size of that of Great Britain. Unfortunately, by this time the restrictions imposed by Versailles and other naval treaties had been flouted by almost all the signatories, leaving Britain with little choice but to accept the new German proposals. The world, however, was somewhat surprised to find that Germany was starting to commission brand new submarines only 4 months after she had agreed to relax the limitations. But it was too late. By September 1939, Germany boasted 57 U-boats. Traditionally, Britain's ports had specific roles. On the east coast, Hull was the main trading port for Northern Europe, Scandinavia and the Baltic. Newcastle was a coal-exporting port, and London was the most important port for the imperial trade with East Africa and the Far East, with the ships of the British India Line, the Orient Line and P&O largely based there. Southampton on the south coast was mainly a passenger port for services to North America. The great Cunard White Star liners, including the Queen Mary, Aquitania, Mauretania, and the almost complete Queen Elizabeth, started their record-breaking voyages from the port. On the west coast, the major ports for North America were Liverpool and Birkenhead. Manchester was home to Cunard's cargo operation, and the company's Port Line, Harrison Line, and the Blue Star Line. Trade with South America was conducted via the Bristol Channel ports. With war looming on the horizon, this pattern of trade had to change. A shift took place away from the more vulnerable ports of the south and east towards the ports of the west and north that were further from the enemy. Similarly, the traditional naval bases of Plymouth, Portsmouth and Chatham were just too close to Germany. So the escorts followed the merchant ships to the north and west, with the major units moving to bases in Scotland. To have a serious effect on Britain's trade with her empire and with her North American partners, the U-boats would have to operate in the western approaches, either north of Ireland into the Clyde or through St. George's Channel into the Irish Sea and Liverpool. These waters had proved rich grounds for the U-boats of the Kaiser's navy, and the first successes of the German submarines had been achieved west of Ireland. It would be some time before U-boats in sufficient numbers were available to take the war further afield. It would also be in this region that the Royal Navy initially deployed its meagre anti-submarine forces. The Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy through most of the Battle of the Atlantic was Admiral of the Fleet Sir Dudley Pound. As First Sea Lord, he was responsible for all the operational and administrative aspects of the British Navy. He was appointed to the job at the age of 62 in June 1939, having been Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean. In some respects, though, he was an odd choice. He suffered from arthritis in his left leg that disturbed his sleep and gave him a pronounced limp. Although this disability never affected his judgment, it did account for certain aspects of his personality. He lacked humour, had no interests outside his work, and he found delegation difficult. Some of his colleagues believed him to be a pressure cooker, barely under control. But his long experience as a naval officer that included the Battle of Jutland and a first-class brain enabled him to cope with the stresses and strains of working with Winston Churchill. He had the courage to resist some of Churchill's wilder naval schemes, helping the war effort considerably. Once he was left in peace to conduct a purely naval operation from the Admiralty, Pound showed sound personal judgment and a readiness to take responsibility for fateful decisions. He was correct more often than he was proved wrong. Certainly no one could criticize Pound's devotion to his duty and the cause for which he was fighting. Admiral Sir Max Houghton is the British naval officer whose name is most synonymous with the victory of the Battle of the Atlantic. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches on the 19th of November 1942 and bore that responsibility until the end of the war. Houghton was the third officer to hold the post. The first had been a hero of the First World War, Admiral Sir Martin Dunbar Naismith, who had earned the Victoria Cross for his exploits as a submarine commander in the Mediterranean. Dunbar Naismith's problems had been huge, and he should take the credit for establishing the first escort groups and a training regime to enable escort crews to approach their task in the most professional manner possible. He formed a tactical training school at Liverpool for escort officers and a work-up facility at Tobermory on the Isle of Mull, where ships could practice their tactics under the watchful eye of the notorious Vice Admiral Gilbert Stevenson, the terror of Tobermory. Dunbar Naismith was also responsible for the relocation of the Western Approaches HQ from Plymouth to Derby House in Liverpool, where it was much closer to the heart of the battle. It was shortly after this move, on the 17th of February 1941, that he was relieved as Commander-in-Chief by Admiral Sir Percy Noble. Dunbar Naismith remained as Commander-in-Chief of the Plymouth Command. Admiral Noble was an agile, clever and popular officer, known for his fastidious dress and cleanliness. But apart from his personal eccentricities, Noble was responsible for much of the victory his command eventually achieved over the German U-boats. In particular, he devoted much effort to improving cooperation between the Royal Navy and Coastal Command of the Royal Air Force, in which he was ably assisted by the then Commander-in-Chief Coastal Command, Air Vice Marshal J.M. Robb. This essential inter-service partnership was enhanced with the transfer of operational control of Coastal Command from the RAF to the Admiralty on the 15th of April 1941. The possibility of transferring Coastal Command bodily to the Navy was considered, but rejected for bureaucratic reasons. In his efforts to improve relations and operational compatibility between the Americans, Canadians and the British, Noble had some success. To enable him to continue with this part of his task, he was relieved as Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches on the 19th of November 1942 and appointed as head of the British Naval Mission in Washington. He was replaced by Admiral Sir Max Haughton, who was until then Flag Officer Submarines. Haughton, a much more flamboyant figure than Noble, had been handed the blueprint for victory. He looked young for his 60 years and had been a submariner from the beginnings of his naval career. After joining the Royal Navy's submarine service in 1904, he commanded his first boat a year later. He served in submarines throughout the First World War and gained distinction by being the first British submarine commander to sink a German warship. To mark this victory, he introduced the custom of flying the skull and crossbones on return from a successful patrol, a custom still practiced in the Royal Navy today. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Haughton was the Vice Admiral in command of the Reserve Fleet and was briefly in command of the Northern Patrol until Churchill appointed him head of the Navy's submarine arm. Once given command of the Western Approaches, Haughton became the archetypal poacher-turned-gamekeeper. Haughton's reputation for decisive leadership earned him the job, as well as the fact that he had more knowledge of submarine operations than any other officer on the Allied side. As Flag Officer Submarines, most of his effort had been devoted to the running of the Royal Navy's small and widely scattered submarine force. Now he had to turn his talents and enthusiasm to a strategic situation. His abrasive style soon earned him the nickname of Fire Eater among his subordinates. Further down the line, he was described in rather less respectful terms. He could be dealt with in one of two ways, either by complete submission or a resistance based on superior knowledge. But to resist Haughton required courage and confidence. Few possessed this, one of them being his intelligence advisor, Commander Roger Wynne, head of the submarine tracking room. After what could be described as a frank exchange of views during which Haughton accused Wynne of incompetence, Wynne took Admiral Haughton down to the intelligence cell, showed him all the information available, and asked for Haughton's advice on how to handle it. Haughton, having studied the mass of information for a few minutes, gave in. "Well, I think this is a bit outside my field. It's yours, Roger." This is as close as Haughton ever got to conceding a position, and was the basis for a mutual trust between him and Commander Wynne for the rest of the war. Admiral Ernest King was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy in December 1941. In March of the following year, he combined this post with that of Chief of Naval Operations, becoming not only the administrative head of the U.S. Navy, but also its operational commander. After the Senate confirmed him in the post for 4 years, he remained in the position for the duration of the war. In some respects, he was a strange choice. King was a true Anglophobe. He detested almost everything British. For Roosevelt to appoint him to a position where close relationships with the British would determine the success of the Atlantic campaign seemed almost deliberately provocative on the president's part. At the high command level, General George Marshall, President Roosevelt's chief of staff, was almost the complete opposite. His regard for the British was high, and his relations with Churchill and most British commanders were good. So, to some extent, Marshall's presence compensated for King's influence. Ernest King was born in Lorain, Ohio, in 1878, and was old enough to have served in the Spanish-American War of 1898. He served in a wide variety of posts and built up experience in gunnery, torpedo boats, mining operations, and submarines. King also commanded ships and squadrons, as was the normal career pattern for senior naval officers at the time. Unlike some of his British colleagues during the Atlantic campaign, he was willing to listen to subordinates and to absorb their ideas, although in doing so he often displayed a rudeness that earned him respect but not affection in the service. King was appointed Chief of the Naval Bureau of Aeronautics in 1933, and was largely responsible for the US Navy's development of naval aviation that was far in advance of anything comparable in the Royal Navy. He rose through the positions of aircraft commander in the battle fleet to commander of the US Navy's patrol force. In this post, he became deeply involved in the US Navy's increasing commitment to the Atlantic, and became highly involved personally in the way the battle against the U-boats was being conducted. This may be the cause of his constant interference and involvement in the Atlantic theatre of operations, that contrasted with his attitude to the Pacific War. In the Pacific, King chose senior officers he believed he could trust, such as Chester Nimitz, and let them get on with the job. In the Atlantic, King took personal command. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder was Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, from the beginning of the war to his resignation in 1943. He was at the helm for most of the critical period of the Battle of the Atlantic. Raeder had joined the German Navy in 1894, at the age of 18. A native of Hamburg, he'd served in the High Seas Fleet, commanding a cruiser, before his appointment as Chief of Staff to Admiral Hipper, who commanded the battle cruisers at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Raeder was a committed conservative and German nationalist who strongly believed the Navy could play a pivotal role in restoring Germany's position and greatness during the interwar period. In 1925 he was given command of the Baltic Naval Station, and in 1928 was appointed to the post of Chief of the Naval Command. Under Raeder, the German Navy was transformed. He conceived the so-called pocket battleships, designed to get around the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. He also lay at the heart of the subterfuge that led to Germany having a fully trained and experienced submarine arm, well before the ban on German possession of submarines was revoked. Raeder also masterminded the Z Plan, in which Germany was to build a large, well-equipped fleet based on modern battleships, battlecruisers, and aircraft carriers. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Second World War came 10 years before the plan could reach fruition. Raeder realized that the main role the German Navy could play in the conflict would be the same as in World War I, disrupting enemy trade. The importance of the submarine would be critical. Raeder needed the right man for the job, so Karl Dönitz was made commander of the submarine arm. It was Raeder who urged the German High Command to introduce unrestricted submarine warfare from the beginning of the Second World War. He remembered and had learned how close such a campaign came to success in early 1917. But Hitler equally remembered how the campaign had affected neutral opinion, especially in the United States. Admiral Raeder believed the surface fleet could play an almost equally vital role, and in the early days of the war he sent the few surface warships Germany had into the Atlantic, where they enjoyed limited success. Following the loss of the Bismarck in May 1941, the major surface units of the German Navy were restricted to operations around Norway and in the Baltic. It was his continuing belief in the part the surface warship could play that led to Raeder's downfall. On the 30th of December 1942, a force of German warships, including the pocket battleship Scheer and the heavy cruiser Hipper, sailed from Altenfjord in northern Norway to intercept an Allied convoy bound for Russia. In the ensuing chaos, the German ships were beaten off by a force of British cruisers and destroyers in the Battle of the Barents Sea. This humiliation, which was partly caused by Hitler's lack of resolve on committing surface ships to action, led the Führer to order the scrapping of all the remaining surface ships. Hitler's refusal to countermand this order triggered Raeder's resignation. In an ironic twist, he was replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Karl Dönitz. More than any other leader, Karl Dönitz epitomizes the Battle of the Atlantic. Dönitz was the Commander-in-Chief of the German submarine force from its formation until his promotion to Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy in early 1943. Even then, he maintained a firm hand on his beloved U-boats, only surrendering control in name. He achieved even greater notoriety as the second Führer of National Socialist Germany, after Hitler's death. It had always been intended that Dönitz should take control of the newly formed U-boat force. At the time of its formation in February 1935, Dönitz was the captain of the cruiser Emden. He was 43 years old. Born near Berlin in 1891, he joined the Imperial Navy as a cadet in 1910, graduating as an officer in 1913. When the First World War broke out, he was signals officer of the cruiser Breslau, which was operating in the Mediterranean at the time. In 1916, Dönitz was appointed to the submarine service. After serving with distinction in U-39, he was given command of UC-25 at the beginning of 1918. His reports spoke of his fine military bearing, energy, good manners, diligence, enthusiasm, popularity, and tact with both officers and men. In late 1918, Dönitz was in command of UB-68. While attacking a British convoy in October, he was forced to scuttle his submarine and surrender. His captors noted that he was sullen and introspective. He became obsessed with the loss of his ship. After undergoing psychological examination in Britain, he was repatriated soon after the armistice, but he immediately rejoined the German Navy. Dönitz survived the post-war purge of naval officers which followed the Kaputsch and decided to stay in the Navy. After 2 years as a torpedo boat commander, Dönitz joined the Torpedo and Mine Inspectorate. After a series of sea and staff jobs, he was promoted steadily until he was considered the most appropriate officer to command the new submarine force. On the 1st of October 1935, he was promoted to full captain and appointed Chief of Submarines. Germany could boast 3 small submarines at the time. He worked closely with Admiral Reeder as the new Navy began to take shape, and proposed that Reeder should include 300 submarines in his Z plan. This was the minimum number Dönitz felt would be viable for any forthcoming war with Great Britain. Reeder accepted the figure. At the end of the summer of 1939, Dönitz wrote to Reeder formally expressing his fears over a war with Britain when his force was so unprepared. But he was assured by Hitler himself that no such situation would be allowed to happen. Throughout the war, Dönitz maintained a tight control over his submarines. On the fall of France, he transferred his headquarters to Brittany, where he could be closer to the front line. He was always available to welcome returning crews and maintained a high public relations profile. This was part of his campaign to keep the German people constantly informed of the successes of the U-boats, and thus secure enough resources for the force to keep expanding. This was not always easy. He found himself in constant conflict with the German Navy's biggest enemy, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe. As the war continued, Dönitz constantly developed his concept of operations to reflect the strategic changes taking place. As more U-boats became available, he identified vulnerable areas in the Allied convoy routes and targeted his forces there accordingly. As numbers increased, he introduced the Wolfpack tactics. Although he claimed they were his own invention, he had in fact learned them from his experiences in the First World War. But he certainly enhanced their operations to the point where they almost defeated Allied defensive measures. Yet Dönitz was a realist. He knew that to win the Battle of the Atlantic, his submarines had to sink Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. When in the middle of 1943, he realized that he was losing this battle, he knew that the U-boat campaign was doomed to failure. He did not give up and insisted that more and more resources be allocated to the submarine service. Despite his being the second and last Führer, albeit for only a few days, long enough to sign the German surrender, it was with some reluctance that the Allies put him on trial as a war criminal. The Battle of the Atlantic had mostly been fought within the rules of war, with few breaches of the rules on both sides. However, the sinking of the liner Laconia in September 1942 prompted Dönitz to change the rules concerning aid to survivors. U-boats were not put at risk. The Laconia had been carrying Italian prisoners of war, and a number of U-boats came under attack from Allied aircraft when they were trying to assist the survivors. Following this, Dönitz ordered his commanders not to render assistance and not to pick up survivors except when they could be of use to the submarine or to Germany. U-boat captains were, in his words, to be severe. Remember, he continued, that in his bombing raids on German cities, the enemy has no regard for women and children. This position was in clear breach of the London Protocol of 1936 and led to Dönitz being charged with war crimes. At Nuremberg, the prosecution said that this meant in practice an order to kill survivors. Dönitz argued that putting the safety of the submarine first was the main responsibility of the commanding officer. One of the witnesses for the defense was the Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz told the tribunal that American submarines in the Pacific had virtually the same orders as Dönitz had issued. Dönitz was convicted on a much lesser charge and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He died in 1980. On the outbreak of war, the Royal Navy had few ships capable of escorting convoys. The fleet was based upon some 20 major warships deployed around the world, policing the British Empire and the trade routes which maintained that empire. The resources which had gone into developing dedicated, purpose-built anti-submarine escorts for use in the North Atlantic were largely confined to giving destroyers and sloops a rudimentary fit of basic underwater submarine detection equipment and a few depth charge racks. Surface ships could detect submarines underwater by using two methods. Firstly, hydrophones lowered under the water might hear the noises made by U-boats' engines or propellers, but the submarine had to be very close for this to be effective. Today this is known as passive sonar. Ships were able to detect submarines using crude hydrophones as early as 1918. The more advanced method was to mount an ASDIC transmitter on the bottom of the ship. ASDIC stood for Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, named after a group who looked into the problem in the 1930s. The ASDIC sent out a wave of sound which would rebound off the hull of a submarine. The transmitter then became a receiver which listened for the returning sound wave or echo. This is known today as active sonar. In 1939, the effective ASDIC range was about a mile. By the end of the war, better ASDIC sets were finding submarines well beyond this range. The sinking of the Athenia and other vulnerable merchant ships in the early days of the war caused the Admiralty to examine its position. Even then, the Royal Navy was more concerned about the threat from Germany's few surface ships than it was of submarines, and important convoys were often allocated an old battleship to scare off the Germans. When the convoy system was introduced, its escort might consist of a couple of old First World War destroyers for the last few hundred miles into a British port. Further west than 12 degrees, the convoy would be lucky to have any escort at all, and even if it did, the protection offered by a converted merchant ship with a few old 6-inch guns was minimal. Gradually, efforts were made to address the situation. Existing destroyers and sloops were given an enhanced anti-submarine capability. More suitable merchant ships, particularly large trawlers, were converted to ASW vessels and deployed on coastal work. Following agreements between the United States and Great Britain, 40 obsolete American destroyers were transferred to the Royal Navy, given a quick conversion, and deployed as escorts under the White Ensign. The main task, however, was to find a type of warship dedicated to anti-submarine operations that was cheap, quick, and easy to build in small shipyards, and needed only a small crew to operate it. The answer was in Middlesbrough. Smith's Dock Limited had come up with the idea of such an escort vessel based on their whale catcher Southern Pride. The design was to be a little larger than the whaler, but still small at only just over 1,000 tons. It would need a crew of about 100, had a steam reciprocating engine driving one propeller, which would give it a speed of 16 knots. It carried one 4-inch gun, plus a few smaller anti-aircraft guns, but it had a good ASDIC set and could carry up to 70 depth charges. The Flower-class corvettes, as they became known, were hideous vessels to serve in due to their dreadful seakeeping qualities, but they were ideal for the situation and became immortalized as the fictional corvette Compass Rose in the book and film The Cruel Sea. The Flower class and their successors, the Castles, plugged the gap until something better came along. Once America had joined the war and her massive production capability was working, the Americans lent Britain a number of their destroyer escorts, smaller versions of their destroyers, but better for convoy escort. Britain built her own equivalent, the Hunt class. More importantly, in Britain, the corvette concept was enlarged, given better engines with 2 propellers, increasing the speed to 21 knots, a heavier armament, and a depth charge capacity of 150. Thus, the modern frigate was born. Even so, corvette construction still kept the smaller shipyards busy until the end of the war. Large trawlers and minesweepers were also built, which had a secondary anti-submarine escort role, and older destroyers were converted to escorts as new classes of modern destroyers entered the fleet. By 1942, it was apparent to British and American commanders that the key to success in the Battle of the Atlantic was the aircraft. German U-boats were potent weapons, but they were vulnerable to surprise air attack, either when they were shadowing a convoy or when they were on passage to or from their bases in western France. This became even more crucial when aircraft were equipped with radars that could identify a target many miles away, and when the target could be physically illuminated at night with the use of the Lee light. This was a large searchlight mounted under an aircraft, which could be switched on at the start of an attack. Not only did it give the attacker a better sight of the submarine, it also blinded the crew of the U-boat in the vital moments before they could respond. But the problem was always range. The Atlantic was a huge battlefield, and aircraft of this period did not have the endurance to cover it all. The air gap between Newfoundland, Iceland and the west coast of Britain was always important, and the closing of the gap with aircraft was pivotal to the outcome of the battle. So an urgent priority was given to the acquisition of suitable aircraft. These could either be deployed from ships within the convoy or from strategically located land bases. It was to this end that the Allies occupied Iceland, Greenland and the Faroes, but other bases which could have been useful, like the Azores or Ireland, were denied because of their owners' neutrality. Once the bases were found, then suitable aircraft had to be selected. Britain had considerable pre-war experience of the flying boat, and their versatility was useful especially in the early stages of the battle. The short Sunderland and the consolidated Catalina proved especially effective.
Night and day, the Sunderland flying boats patrol far out to eastward, keeping the German coast under constant surveillance for any sign of unwanted activity.
But the ideal long-range maritime patrol aircraft would have to be based on a bomber design. And such aircraft were hard to find, especially as RAF Bomber Command and the US Air Force jealously guarded the aircraft they had. The constant demands of Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris for his strategic bombing campaign over Germany were such that coastal command of the RAF had to be satisfied with those bombers such as the Wellington, whose bombing role had been taken over by the Avro Lancaster. One aircraft, however, was to have a huge impact on this aspect of the campaign. The consolidated B-24 Liberator had a range of over 2,500 miles, and with long-range fuel tanks added, it could remain airborne for up to 18 hours. It was useful as a bomber, which led to a tug-of-war between bomber and coastal commands once the latter appreciated its potential in the war against the U-boat. Those aircraft which were allocated to coastal command soon proved their worth, as they enabled shore-based air cover to be maintained almost all the way across the North Atlantic. To enable some sort of air cover to be maintained out of range of land-based aircraft, the Allies had to rely on aircraft carried by ships. As fleet aircraft carriers were in short supply and were often needed elsewhere, alternative and cheaper ways of providing that cover had to be found. Initially, a number of cargo ships were equipped with catapults that supported one Hurricane fighter. The role of this CAM, or catapult aircraft merchantman, however, was not anti-submarine operations. It was to shoot down the German Condor reconnaissance bomber, which was a significant threat to convoys as they approached the United Kingdom. The CAM ships were also used extensively on the Arctic convoys. Their main disadvantage was that the aircraft could not be reused, as it had to ditch at the end of its sortie. A further development of this was the Merchant Aircraft Carrier, or MAC, that was a bulk carrier, a tanker or grain ship, with a wooden flat deck built along its length above the hull. This deck meant that the MAC could continue to carry its cargo, but could also launch and recover a small number of aircraft, usually Swordfish or Albacores. These aircraft, although unsuitable for other duties, were ideal for short-range anti-submarine operations. The final development along these lines was the dedicated escort aircraft carrier. These were either built from scratch or converted from existing hulls. Almost all were built in the United States, and they served not only as anti-submarine carriers, but also as support fleet carriers, largely in the Pacific. One of these could provide almost permanent air cover for a convoy, its only serious limitation being the weather. It could carry up to 30 aircraft, including both fighters and anti-submarine aircraft such as the Grumman Avenger. The first German submarines, or U-boats, were based on designs which bore a striking resemblance to the UB-2 type submarines introduced by the Germans near the end of the First World War. The Type 1A was a medium-sized boat of 600 tons, based on a submarine being built for Turkey. Only 2 were constructed, and they were relegated to training duties on the outbreak of hostilities. The Type 2A was a small coastal submarine. Although 6 were built, their part in the war was also very restricted, mainly due to their range of only just over 1,000 miles. The Types 2B, C and D were modifications of this design. Again, their relatively small size of about 300 tons limited their wartime activity considerably. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought by 2 main types of U-boat, the medium-range Type 7 and the long-range Type 9, with production concentrated on these 2. Both had been designed in the mid-1930s, yet were not surpassed until the latter stages of the war. The Type 7 had a displacement of some 700 tons, although later variants reached almost 1,000. They were 220 feet long and equipped with 5 21-inch torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 1 aft. Altogether, they carried 14 torpedoes, or mines. Using their diesel engines on the surface, they boasted a radius of action of some 6,500 miles, although the Type 7C-42 and other later versions could manage almost 10,000 miles. Submerged using batteries, the Type 7 could manage about 80 miles at 4 knots. They carried a crew of 44, and if necessary, could dive to about 650 feet. The Type 9 were somewhat larger, with earlier versions displacing just over 1,000 tons, growing to 1,600 tons with the Type 9D2. Early versions had a radius of over 8,000 miles, growing to 11,000 miles as the design evolved. They could carry up to 22 torpedoes or mines for their 6 torpedo tubes, 4 of which were in the bow and 2 located in the stern. They carried crews of about 55. Both classes could remain submerged for about 24 hours. After that, they would have to surface to recharge their batteries and replace the stale air inside the U-boat. Both types carried a deck gun armament, mainly for use against merchant ships, but later they were used more for self-defense when the submarines were caught on the surface by aircraft. As this possibility became increasingly common, more anti-aircraft guns were added. The larger gun carried on the foredeck was a 3.5-inch on the Type 7 or a 4-inch on the Type 9. A variety of 2 or 3 37mm and 20mm guns constituted the secondary armament. Later in the war, the larger gun was replaced on some boats by additional anti-aircraft guns. To support these classes, special supply submarines were built large enough to carry supplies, enabling the attack U-boats to remain on station longer. Previously, they could only lengthen their patrols by storing food and other supplies in existing living compartments, leaving the conditions on board even more squalid than they were normally. Such Milchkau submarines displaced almost 2,000 tons and could carry up to 432 tons of oil, in addition to food and other supplies. Only 10 were commissioned. By limiting large-scale production of U-boats to the two main designs, the Germans found it difficult to improve performance, whereas British and American boats were constructed in classes built either for a specific purpose or to reflect technical advances. The relatively small size of most U-boats also limited how much additional equipment, like new communication systems or radars, could be fitted. Living conditions on both these classes were poor. The crew had to sleep wherever they could find space, which was often on top of the torpedoes. A crew had to share one toilet. The temperature could be very hot or freezing cold. Air conditioning was non-existent. With little room for food or water, rations were basic, and the crew often went for weeks or months without washing or shaving. After being underwater for hours, the air would become stale, and there was always the possibility of a slow, lingering death or of instantaneous destruction. But by 1943, it was becoming more obvious that these outdated designs would not be able to match new Allied anti-submarine warfare techniques. New concepts had to be found. The first of these was the Schnorkel-fitted high-speed submarine with a much greater battery capacity, designed for continuous submerged patrols. Such submarines would be far less vulnerable to the long-range aircraft the Allies were now using to hunt for submarines on the surface. At the same time, the gun armament was to be sacrificed for a much more streamlined hull, with a resulting increase in speed. Over 12 knots could be maintained underwater, a substantial improvement on the 4 knots achieved by the earlier designs. Two types of submarine were to be built using these principles: the Type 21 for long-range deep-sea patrols, and the Type 23 for coastal duties. Their high underwater speeds could only be maintained for short periods before the batteries needed recharging. The answer to this problem was a gas-driven closed turbine, which would be independent of external air. This system had been developed by an engineer called Helmut Walter, who used hydrogen peroxide as the gas. Development was slow, however, and only a few experimental submarines were built. No U-boats using this system ever entered service. On the whole, German submarines were good conventional types, well fitted for their purpose, but the German Navy stayed with the early submarines for too long before incorporating radical technologies. By the time they became available, it was too late. The battle had been lost. Submarines are by nature lone hunters, and initially Dönitz used them to act independently in areas where Allied shipping was bound to turn up. In the early stages of the war, these tended to be the western approaches to the United Kingdom or in the North Sea. As Allied responses became more successful and as more U-boats became available, Dönitz moved them further west and deeper into the Atlantic. After the fall of France, when the ports of the French Atlantic coast became available, he pushed this boundary much further west. By that stage, U-boats could operate almost to the North American coastline. When the United States entered the war, submarines were deployed as far south as the Caribbean, with notable success. But to remain effective for long periods, U-boats operating in these distant waters had to be resupplied regularly. Initially, this was achieved by the use of disguised merchant ships. Thanks to good intelligence, the Allies soon located and destroyed these hidden enemies. Dönitz then had to turn to the Milchkau supply submarines for replenishing supplies. Dönitz claimed that the tactic of the wolf pack was his own invention, but in fact such methods had been used to attack Allied shipping in the First World War. However, Dönitz developed the concept much further, especially when he was able to deploy over 40 U-boats into the Atlantic at any one time. In practice, this meant intelligence sources would identify a convoy of Allied merchant ships and its track could be assessed. Dönitz would then order as many U-boats as practical to lie in its path. This could be as many as 12 submarines, or even more. This force, or wolf pack, would be given a code name and a commander would be chosen. If the plan worked, as it did on many occasions, then the convoy would be attacked as it entered the area, with the sheer number of U-boats overwhelming the escorts. U-boats proved most effective when attacking at night. During daylight, they shadowed the convoy on the surface. As darkness descended, the submarine would submerge and find a suitable position for the attack. Braver commanders would go within the convoy itself. Ideally, a commander would find a position from which a salvo of torpedoes could be launched at a cluster of targets. Should one of the salvo miss its first target, there would be a reasonable chance that it would hit a second or even third. This firing solution was very hard to create, and usually a commander would have to be content with firing at one target, then changing position before the escort could react. He might have time to launch a second spread at another target or part of the convoy. Using these techniques, a U-boat could hit 2 or 3 targets before the attack had to be abandoned. In effect, the Germans simply used their U-boats as torpedo boats, which could only submerge for short periods. The main objective of the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic was to get merchant ships into British ports unscathed. If merchant ships were to sail alone, they would be easy prey for German submarines. Even if ships were armed, they would be able to do little against a torpedo attack from a submerged U-boat. The only ships that could sail alone were the large passenger liners like the 2 Cunard Queens, which relied on their speed for protection. Other merchant ships were grouped together into a convoy. A convoy could consist of 60 ships, although most were about 40 strong. They were either fast at about 15 knots or slow at perhaps 10 knots. Convoys were identified by a code that was based on their destination or origin. For example, in the early days, OA coded convoys sailed from the south coast ports, OB from Liverpool, OG convoys went to Gibraltar. Later, the coding system was changed to make life more difficult for the Germans and to reflect the much more complex pattern of convoy use. Ideally, convoys would be escorted, but such was the shortage of escorts at the start of the war that most convoys could only be given naval protection as far as 12 degrees west. Before and after that line, they were on their own. Even if they did have an escort, it would probably be an armed merchant cruiser, plus perhaps 1 or 2 destroyers or trawlers. As more escorts became available, the limit of protection was moved further west until it reached the North American coastline. By late 1941, a convoy could expect to have perhaps 4 or even 6 escort vessels. By 1943, enough vessels existed for some of them to be formed into escort groups that would roam the North Atlantic, ready to reinforce the escorts of convoys under attack, or even go hunting U-boats at will. A convoy could also have 1 or 2 rescue ships attached to it, to release escorts or merchant ships from the obligation of rescuing survivors from ships that had sunk. If an escorted convoy came under attack, the escort ships would attempt to find and destroy the submarine. U-boats could be located using ASDIC apparatus and attacked using depth charges, that is, bombs set to explode at preset depths underwater using pressure detonators. The escort would try to sail over the submarine and drop its charges over the stern onto the target. Later, depth charge throwers were fitted to ships that enabled them to use a wider pattern of charges. The depth charges could damage the submarine enough for it to be forced to the surface and be sunk by gunfire, or even by ramming. This latter was discouraged, as it often put the escort out of action as well, and on one occasion the ramming ship, an American destroyer, was sunk with all the crew on board. A well-aimed depth charge could sink a U-boat underwater, although the preferred effect was to explode a charge on either side of the submarine, thus crushing its hull in between. If an aircraft were to find a U-boat on the surface, it would try to force the submarine to dive and drop its depth charges just as the U-boat slid beneath the surface, when it was at its most vulnerable. Such was the success rate that Dönitz ordered U-boat commanders to remain on the surface and engage the attacking aircraft using their anti-aircraft guns. Some even managed to shoot down their assailants, but this was rare. Most U-boats lost, and Dönitz soon changed his mind. Both sides soon realized that intelligence was critical to the battle. The Allies needed to know where the U-boats were, and the Germans had to know the routes of the convoys. Both sides began with little intelligence. The Admiralty turned to the use of signals intelligence. For this, it needed an efficient intelligence gathering centre and an organisation that could process the information quickly and send it to where it was needed. The Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park was already using intercepts from U-boats and U-boat HQ to work out the location of enemy submarines. This information was passed to the Naval Intelligence Division's submarine tracking room, where senior commanders were advised on where and when convoys should be rerouted. The only problem was that Bletchley Park could not instantly decode information without access to the German codes and the Enigma machine, which coded and decoded the information. To solve this problem, the Admiralty encouraged Allied ships' crews to try and capture an Enigma machine. In May 1941, convoy OB-318 was attacked. 7 U-boats were involved, including U-110, commanded by Julius Lemp, the man who had sunk the Athenia. During the attack, U-110 was badly damaged and surfaced. Lemp ordered the crew to abandon the ship and scuttle the submarine. But the scuttling did not go according to plan, and the U-boat didn't sink immediately. A British boarding party from HMS Bulldog went on board and discovered that neither the Enigma machine nor its codebooks had been destroyed. When these were removed and sent to the UK, the Admiralty was overjoyed. By a clever use of subterfuge, the British also managed to convince the Germans that U-110 had sunk, taking all her secrets with her. When this information was combined with improvements in direction-finding techniques, such as high-frequency systems, HFDF, known as HFDUF, it gave the British a significant advantage. But the Allies still had one problem. They needed to train people to use the technology and to interpret it. This took time that the Allies did not have. There was also the temptation with the Enigma information to use it immediately to hunt U-boats. While this could have saved ships and lives, it would surely have told the Germans that the codes had been cracked. The information had to be used very carefully. Once the Allies' ability to read U-boat signals became known, the Germans added a 4th rotor to their Enigma machines. It took until the 13th of December 1942 before Bletchley Park managed to break the new system, although it was still to be some time before the Allies were confident that the information they were getting was accurate. The Germans had their equivalent in intelligence gathering, but it never quite matched the successes of the Allies. Their radio observation service, known as B-Dienst, managed to gather significant successes in the early stages of the war by using Allied radio traffic interception to identify the nature and whereabouts of Allied convoys. The Germans cracked Allied codes. This was most notable in the case of the Admiralty's Naval Cipher No. 3, which B-Dienst broke in early 1942. This enabled the Germans to read some 80% of signals sent using this code. It was early in 1943 before the Allies realized this had happened, and a new Naval Cipher No. 5 was introduced. The Germans never succeeded in breaking this. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun with the sinking of the Athenia. A month later, the full potential of the U-boat was revealed. On the 13th of October, Gunther Prien in U-47 entered the naval base of Scapa Flow in the Orkneys and sank the battleship Royal Oak while she lay at anchor. 786 British sailors died. In that first autumn of the war, German submarines also sank the aircraft carrier HMS Courageous and attacked the battleships Nelson and Rodney and the battlecruiser Hood, pride of the Royal Navy. Yet Dönitz knew right from the start that he did not have the resources he needed to conduct an effective submarine war in the North Atlantic. By the 3rd of September 1939, he had 57 U-boats at his disposal. Not enough to be effective. He also had other problems. Hitler was initially reluctant to introduce unrestricted submarine warfare, as he feared the impact it would have amongst neutral countries. Hitler also insisted that German submarines follow the prize rules, whereby the submarine commander had to confirm that the target was a legitimate one before it could be sunk or captured. The problem with this approach was that the submarine would have to surface and make itself more vulnerable to counterattack. Dönitz was also far from convinced that the torpedoes the U-boats carried were reliable enough. This was borne out when torpedoes failed to explode or went astray, as happened when HMS Hood was attacked. But one thing his experience of the First World War had taught Dönitz was that all that mattered was tonnage. His submarines needed to sink Allied merchant ships at a greater rate than they could be replaced by new ones. If this happened, then Britain could be starved into surrender. If it didn't happen, then Britain could only be defeated by invasion. Successes against large warships like the Royal Oak and the Courageous were excellent advertisements for the potential of the U-boat. But Dönitz argued that the real campaign should be against the merchant ships, which kept Britain fed and fueled and able to fight. Dönitz convinced his commander-in-chief, Grand Admiral Reeder, that 300 U-boats were needed to guarantee success. Hitler appreciated the argument but stopped short of giving the U-boat force his top priority. The German army still lay at the root of Hitler's belief in victory, and Goering argued convincingly for more resources for his air force. So it was well into 1940 before Dönitz even began to receive new submarines in the numbers he needed. But this didn't stop him from beginning an aggressive campaign immediately, and once more using his World War I experience, he lost no time in introducing his Wolfpack tactics. In the meantime, the British introduced the convoy system that had turned the campaign in the Allies' favour 22 years earlier. This was largely forced on the British, who believed that the sinking of the liner Athenia heralded an early return to unrestricted submarine warfare. But the British were short of escort ships, suitable aircraft, and modern technology such as ASDIC and radar. It also took time to put the convoys together, and while the convoys were being organised, the U-boats pounced on unescorted merchant ships. British anti-submarine tactics were also confused. The Royal Navy's natural philosophy was to attack the enemy, not defend convoys. So escort groups were formed to go out and find U-boats. The British had neither the ships nor the training and experience to do this, and in the beginning even used large fleet aircraft carriers as part of these groups. The loss of HMS Courageous while on an anti-submarine patrol helped convince the Admiralty that this tactic was suicidal. The groups were also rediscovering how elusive submarines can be, as mile upon mile of ocean was examined with little success. The Royal Navy soon reverted to providing convoy escorts. So quite early in the campaign, the battle between the Wolfpack and the convoy was joined. Dönitz's first effort was not a success, however. He had hoped to bring together 9 boats to concentrate on an attack against a convoy in October 1939. But unserviceability, enemy action and other priorities reduced this to 3 when convoy HG3 was sighted on the 17th. Only 3 merchant ships were lost before the U-boats were forced to withdraw. Dönitz realized that his force would have to be significantly bigger if the tactic was to succeed. He released his submarines so they could return to independent operations. But by this time he had achieved one success. He had persuaded Hitler to relax the prize rules so ships could be attacked at will. However, Hitler would still not allocate the resources Dönitz needed for his 300-boat fleet. The first phase of the Battle of the Atlantic was inconclusive. The Germans did not have enough submarines to be truly effective, and the British lacked the numbers of escorts. But both sides were active. German submarine production was increasing, although initially not fast enough to provide replacements for U-boats lost. They were also working hard to improve the reliability of their torpedoes. And the British were busy converting old warships and suitable merchant ships into escorts, as well as ordering new ones. Both sides claimed successes, but if anything it was the British who had won the first round, by a very narrow margin. 17 U-boats had been sunk, and the convoys were getting through, mostly unscathed. This situation was not to last. The capture of the French ports following the fall of France was vital to the U-boat campaign. On the 23rd of June 1940, a convoy of trucks left Wilhelmshaven, loaded with submarine spares, weapons and equipment. They were bound for Lorient in southern Brittany, where the first French U-boat base was being established. Shortly afterwards, Dönitz commandeered a villa in nearby Kurneval. This became his headquarters, and from here he and his staff directed the U-boat war. Bases were also set up at Brest, Saint-Nazaire and La Pallice. Now U-boats could sail straight into the Atlantic without the long voyage from their bases in Germany. It meant submarines were able to stay on patrol for longer, and more submarines were available at any one time. Soon, massive concrete pens were built to protect U-boats from aerial bombing, while they were undergoing maintenance in port. The failure of the RAF to bomb such bases while the pens were being built was to prove a costly mistake. Using his new geographical advantages, Dönitz returned to his idea of using submarines in a pack. 6 boats were placed under the command of Gunther Prien, the man who sank the Royal Oak, and 5 boats were assigned to Hans Rosing. The concept was good, but still there were problems of communications, and both the target convoys arrived at their destinations unscathed. Dönitz then decided to attack independent ships, and during June 1940 his U-boats sank 58 victims. Only a fifth of them were in convoy. The British were worried. By summer 1940, the fear of invasion was diverting escorts into the areas around the English Channel. This meant that convoy escorts were reduced, in some cases, to just 1 ship. The fall of France had also enabled German long-range bombers to attack British shipping in the southwest approaches, where a combination of U-boats and aircraft sank the liner Empress of Britain. So the British moved their convoy routes to the northwest. This, however, made them vulnerable to short-range U-boats operating from bases in Norway. The British did have one advantage, although not of their making. Continued rivalry between Dönitz and Göring meant that there were never enough German long-range aircraft available to provide reconnaissance patrols. The Luftwaffe was heavily engaged in the Battle of Britain, and Göring had little time for the Atlantic campaign, which he brushed off as merely a sideshow. Most of the cards, however, still lay with the Germans. U-boats based in France could now operate as far west as 25 degrees west. British escorts could only reach 17 degrees, and Coastal Command's Sunderlands could only provide cover out to 15 degrees. The British had to find an answer. One solution was to increase the number of escorts. In the long term they could be built, but in the short term Churchill would have to persuade Roosevelt to lend Britain 40 old destroyers. They were ill-equipped, possessed poor seakeeping qualities, and they needed to be adapted for anti-submarine operations. But they came. Throughout the autumn of 1940, the U-boats gained the upper hand. Attacking on the surface at night, they started to cause losses which the British found hard to sustain. Escort tactics were poor, and the Germans were learning quickly. Convoys were attacked at night. The U-boats would shadow by day and attack again the next night. Some very successful U-boat commanders, such as Prien and Otto Kretschmer, became household names back in Germany and were accorded the status of aces. This was very much part of Dönitz's astute public relations campaign. That is, convince the public of the U-boat's success, and the Nazi leadership will have to give the force more resources. In October 1940, convoy SC-7 left Halifax for Liverpool. It lost 17 ships out of 35. In the same month, convoy HX-79 lost 14 ships, and HX-79A lost 7. In the space of less than a week, 38 merchant ships had been sunk by U-boats. No wonder the Germans called this period the happy time. Britain responded in 3 ways. Escorts were released from anti-submarine duties. They were given radar, and more aircraft were provided as older bombers, replaced by newer models in Bomber Command, were released to Coastal Command. Tactically, there were changes as escorts were told not to leave the convoys unescorted as they chased contacts, often spurious, all over the seas. The convoy was never to be left unprotected. Slowly, these measures began to take effect, and there were successes for the escorts. But the reduction in losses to U-boat attack in the late 1940 was more due to submarine unserviceability and bad weather than new British tactics. To compensate for the bad weather, the U-boats moved south, where they found rich pickings in the shipping off the West African coast, where escorts were non-existent. During the winter of 1940-41, the Allies started to fight back. The big reorganization in the command and control structure, which saw the creation of new, partly unified commands and the better use of joint intelligence, started to have an impact. Losses were still happening, but proportionately they were less than in the desperate autumn of 1940. Even the aces began to encounter more resolute defenses as they attacked. In March 1942, Prien himself was lost when attacking convoy OB-293. Kretschmer surrendered after being forced to surface and scuttle U-99. A third ace, Joachim Schepke, was crushed between the bow of HMS Vanoc and his own periscope, as his U-boat was rammed and sunk. These losses were a serious blow to Dönitz, especially as they meant that 5 U-boats had been lost in 3 weeks for the exchange rate of 15 Allied merchant ships. This loss rate was unsustainable, and Dönitz was still suffering from a lack of available submarines. He decided to change tactics. In April 1941, Dönitz decided to move his 9 operational deep-sea U-boats further west to establish a patrol line at 30 degrees. This soon reaped dividends when convoy SC-26 lost 11 ships. The cost to the Germans was 1 U-boat. This forced the British to develop further the facilities on Iceland, particularly the airfields. Sunderlands and Hudsons were sent to the island and helped to push the protection screen further west. But the problem remained that there were not enough escorts or long-range aircraft available to provide the necessary cover. The capture of the Enigma machine offered the Allies some respite, but again it was to be some time before the full impact of the capture could be assessed and the information it released used. This and other technical advances needed time. Operators and assessors had to be trained, and experience had to be gained. However, one advantage to the British was now beginning to produce results. The increasingly obvious support for the British by the Americans had not only led to the lease of the 40 old destroyers, but also to the Americans themselves becoming more involved. As early as October 1939, the Americans had declared a security zone around the coastline of the United States. This meant that British shipping was safe from attack while in the zone. On the 10th of April 1941, President Roosevelt said that the safety zone would be moved from 60 degrees west to 26 degrees west. At the same time, he announced that British warships could be repaired and refitted in American dockyards. This blatant abuse of the neutrality rules meant that the security zone now stretched 2,300 nautical miles across the Atlantic, and included the Azores. It was inevitable that U-boats would become more and more confused about where they could operate and who the enemy was, especially when American warships were seen to be escorting British convoys within the neutrality zone. Mistakes occurred. American warships were attacked, and one, the USS Reuben James, was sunk with heavy loss of life. More American merchant ships were also being attacked, usually by accident, but in some cases deliberately. Hitler had to issue a direct command to stop German U-boats targeting Americans. He was still desperately worried about provoking the United States into war. Things were getting bad for the Germans, and Dönitz was infuriated at what he saw as blatant interference by a neutral state. By the summer of 1941, he was also concerned at increasing losses amongst the German supply ships, which were maintaining and resupplying submarines in the more distant waters. These losses were the first tangible benefits of the cracking of the German codes by Bletchley Park. In June, things became even worse for the Germans, as President Roosevelt ordered American forces to occupy Iceland. Within a few months, the island had become a very well-equipped and well-defended Allied base, instead of merely being the home to a few RAF Coastal Command squadrons. But still, Hitler refused to react. And in August 1941, a U-boat was actually captured almost fully intact by a combination of surface escorts and RAF Coastal Command aircraft based in Iceland. Unfortunately, the crew of U-570 managed to destroy their secret equipment and documents before their ship was boarded. After being thoroughly examined, the U-boat was taken into the Royal Navy and named HMS Graf. By the end of 1941, the situation was improving significantly for the British. Dönitz was still chronically short of U-boats. Allied anti-submarine equipment and experience were improving, and the growing American involvement was having an effect. At the same time, Hitler ordered Dönitz to send his valuable submarines to support the campaigns against the Russians and in the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean, some very visible successes were achieved. The legendary aircraft carrier Ark Royal was sunk, and the old battleship Barham was destroyed most spectacularly by U-331. But Dönitz knew that these would not win the war. The Japanese attacked the US Pacific Fleet's base at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands on the 7th of December 1941. But the United States had been in conflict with Germany for some time before Germany officially declared war on the 11th of December. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark, admitted this when he said, "We are at war," in October 1941, following the sinking of the Reuben James. Following the official declaration, however, the situation in the North Atlantic became much clearer, and Dönitz, who knew the implications of US entry, could at least recognize who the enemy was. But he realized that in the long term, American war production would be crucial to his idea of a tonnage war. He calculated that just over 800,000 tons would have to be sunk each month if his campaign was to succeed. The figures for the last 6 months of 1941 did not give him much cause for optimism. Only 120,000 was being sunk each month. At last, U-boat production was beginning to pick up. Dönitz had 91 U-boats available in January 1942. By July, this had increased to 138. This still meant he had nowhere near enough. Many boats would be in maintenance, on training duties, or still working up to operational fitness. So on the 1st of January 1942, Dönitz was only able to deploy 6 boats against the United States. This did not stop him. He began the campaign almost immediately. He called it Operation Paukenschlag, or Operation Drumbeat. He told the 6 commanders to avoid convoys and operate independently. Attempts were made to track the submarines, but bad weather and operational difficulties meant that the information available to the Allies was inconclusive. On the 12th of January, U-123 found the first victim. In all, the operation accounted for 41 merchant ships, for no German losses. It was the second happy time. The Americans, despite their already significant experience, were totally unprepared. Many of their escorts had been sent to the Pacific. The ones that remained were poorly equipped and manned by inexperienced crews. Ironically, the best anti-submarine units available were 7 US Coast Guard cutters. It was perhaps now a source of regret that many of the ships the Americans could have used had already been sent to Britain under Lend-Lease arrangements. Admiral King would not introduce convoys until he had the ships to escort them. This was against all the advice of the British, who had experienced similar problems themselves 2 years earlier. But King refused to accept British advice, nor did the American Eastern Sea Frontier Command have the aircraft it needed. These had been seconded to fleet protection, and in any case, many of them were under the control of the Army Air Force, with whom the Navy did not work well. To help, the British temporarily lent the Americans 10 corvettes and 24 trawlers until US forces became available. The Americans realized quickly that things would have to improve and set about producing new command and control systems to enable all the parties to work together more closely. At last they began to learn the lessons of the British experience. They also began a huge construction program. But the U-boats continued their deadly work. They moved south into the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. They even surfaced and used their deck guns to shell oil installations ashore. The American reaction was poor. Even when U-boats were located, inexperienced escort crews lost them or failed to press home their attacks. On one occasion, a merchant ship opened fire on an American destroyer, believing her to be a U-boat. The destroyer's captain and 2 sailors were killed. The British tried and tried to convince Admiral King to introduce convoys, but still he refused, believing that a convoy not escorted properly would be a bigger liability than merchant ships sailing individually. The British also tried to get the Americans to shift priorities from the Pacific to the Atlantic. While this was going on, the Germans continued to exact a heavy toll off the eastern seaboard of the United States, where ships were often sunk within visual distance of the coast. No blackout had been introduced. This made spotting merchant ships much easier for the U-boats, as they were silhouetted against the lights of the cities. By March, things were beginning to improve as new escorts began to arrive, but it was still May 1942 before the Americans began to convoy ships down the east coast and into the Gulf. Once this happened, the number of easy targets for the U-boats began to decline, and so Dönitz turned his attention back to the North Atlantic convoys and reintroduced his wolf packs. He still had to attain his required number of sinkings to keep his tonnage war on track. Despite improvements to the American anti-submarine capability, the demands of the Pacific drew more and more resources into it, leaving the Battle of the Atlantic to the British and the Canadians. A mid-ocean escort force was formed based in Newfoundland, which would take convoys straight from Newfoundland to the coast of Ireland. More new escorts were entering service, including the first of the new purpose-built super corvettes, which became known as frigates. But as new ships entered the fray, their lack of experience became critical. This was especially true in the case of the Royal Canadian Navy, that had expanded from almost nothing to provide 33% of the escort vessels in a matter of 18 months. It was not surprising that the Canadians were not as competent as they were expected to be. The convoy battle was rejoined with a new fervour, and the Atlantic War was about to reach its most critical phase. The climax of the Battle of the Atlantic was reached in the early spring of 1943, but there were already signs that the campaign was entering its most crucial phase as soon as the German U-boats rejoined the battle against the North Atlantic convoys in the summer of 1942. Admiral Pound, the first Sea Lord, realized that Dönitz would have to put almost all his effort into the North Atlantic if he was to win. At the beginning of this phase, the British were still suffering from a shortage of escorts, not helped by the dispatch of 2 escort groups to the United States waters. Admiral Pound's belief that this was leaving the North Atlantic too exposed seemed to be confirmed in July, when convoy ON-113 encountered a large force of U-boats. In the ensuing battle, a U-boat was sunk and the rest driven off thanks to a well-coordinated defense. However, 3 merchant ships were lost. The determination and tactics of the defending forces moved Dönitz to broadcast to the German people, telling them to prepare for heavy losses. In early August, he sent a pack in to attack convoy SC-94. 2 U-boats were sunk, but not before a third of the convoy had been destroyed. The Allies realized that there had to be a change of tactics. The first of these was the creation of the Escort Support Group, a squadron of fast escorts which could go to the aid of a convoy under threat. The first of them, the 20th, was commanded by Commander E.F. Johnny Walker, a name which became synonymous with the victory in the Atlantic, as did that of his flagship, the sloop HMS Starling. Like all good ideas, however, it took some time to reach fruition, and the escort groups were not to be effective for some 6 months. The continuing problem of air cover was also being addressed both by increasing the number of very long-range aircraft available and by providing ships which could carry short-range aircraft, the Mack and the escort carrier. A further change in Allied tactics, made possible by the number of long-range aircraft, was taking the battle to the enemy, attacking the submarines while they were on transit into or out of their secure bases on the west coast of France. Air-mounted radars and the Lee light made this possible even at night. Early successes in the Battle of the Bay were encouraging. Not many U-boats were sunk, but submarine commanders realized they were vulnerable at night and so had to transit the Bay of Biscay underwater, adding to their patrol times. This also had the knock-on effect of the Germans allocating long-range Ju-88 fighters to the west of France, hoping to shoot down the Allied anti-submarine aircraft. The British reply to introduce the long-range Beaufighter into the campaign proved more than a match for the Germans. The war against the convoys continued. Convoy ONS-154 sailed into a force of 20 U-boats in December 1942. 14 merchant ships were lost for 1 U-boat. TM-1, a tanker convoy, left Trinidad bound for Gibraltar. It lost 77% of its ships, without sinking even 1 U-boat. These losses forced Churchill and Roosevelt to make the Battle of the Atlantic their priority. Although the Torch landings in North Africa had been a success, the real victory would involve a landing in Europe. For this to be successful, vast amounts of men and munitions would have to be massed in Britain prior to the invasion. Much of these would have to come across the Atlantic, and if they were to do so successfully, disasters like ONS-154 and TM-1 had to be avoided. The appalling weather of January 1943 gave the convoys some respite from attack, but it was short. In February, SC-118 lost 13 ships at a cost to the Germans of 3 U-boats sunk and 4 badly damaged. In the same month, convoy ON-166 was attacked by 21 U-boats. 14 merchant ships were lost, 2 U-boats sunk. But the Allies were learning. The climax of the Battle of the Atlantic revolved around 4 convoys: SC-121, SC-122, HX-228, and HX-229. SC-121 was attacked by 2 packs totaling 24 submarines. The convoy's escort was weak, and 13 ships were lost. As a result, HX-228, which sailed a few days later, was ordered to move south. Although it was spotted, it had a heavy escort, which included an escort carrier, USS Bogue. The battle was chaotic, but only 4 merchant ships and 1 destroyer had been sunk. 2 U-boats were also lost. The other 2 convoys, SC-122 and HX-229, were attacked almost simultaneously and suffered severe losses. They were only saved from catastrophe by the arrival of Coastal Command aircraft. But still, 22 ships were sunk for the loss of 1 U-boat. Dönitz was jubilant, and the Allies desperate. For the first time, it seemed that communications between North America and Great Britain could be severed. But actually, the lessons of these 4 convoys on deeper analysis revealed that at last the Allied effort in providing more escorts and long-range aircraft were beginning to work. The number of U-boats used was huge, and proportionately the Allied losses were not that high. It was difficult to understand this when the North Atlantic seemed full of sinking ships, but the operational analysis teams were far from pessimistic. They believed the Allies were on the verge of success. Between the 4th and 7th of April, an attack took place against convoy HX-231. 3 ships were sunk, but 2 U-boats were destroyed and another 4 badly damaged. On the 29th of April, convoy ONS-5 ran into the largest wolf pack of the war, 40 U-boats. 1 ship was sunk that night. On the 4th of May, 6 ships were sunk. The following day, 7 more. But the U-boats were decimated. 8 were sunk and 5 very badly damaged. Dönitz called off the attack. Losses on this scale were unbearable. 2 weeks later, he tried again. On the 16th of May, convoy HX-237 made it to Liverpool, having lost just 3 merchant ships. 3 U-boats had been sunk. Convoy SC-130, whose escort was commanded by Commander Peter Gretton, who was due to get married at the end of the voyage, ran into 33 U-boats. In the ensuing battle, not 1 merchant ship was sunk, but 5 U-boats had been destroyed, 1 containing Lieutenant Peter Dönitz, the Commander-in-Chief's son. Gretton got married. At last, all the Allied assets, land, sea, air, intelligence, technology and training had come together. The result had been the destruction of 31 U-boats in little over a month. On the 24th of May, Dönitz ordered his boats out of the North Atlantic. He assured them that this was a temporary setback. But he, like most of his crews, suspected the battle was lost. In May 1943, the U-boats were beaten. But the battle did not end, nor was it to do so until the last day of the war. But they were never to threaten the North Atlantic in the same way again. From now on, they would deploy singly and attack targets of opportunity. As such, they were constantly a threat to Allied operations, and were sinking Allied ships right up until the end of the war. But the existing submarines had been outpaced by technology. By the middle of 1943, the Type 7 and 9 U-boats were no match for the combination of ships, aircraft, detection systems and weapons the Allies were putting into service. By the time the new technology U-boats were entering the conflict in late 1944, the war was all but over. By 1944, also many U-boats were being destroyed before they could enter service, as Allied bombers attacked the shipyards. The Allies continued to hunt and destroy submarines wherever possible. But after the spring of 1943, it became a battle of aggression, not of defense. New long-range aircraft, protected by long-range fighters, took the fight deep into the Bay of Biscay. And on the 20th of June, Captain Walker took his escort group into the bay to work with the aircraft. His primary target was the supply of Milchkau submarines, which were enabling U-boats to operate in many areas away from the North Atlantic. Together, they sank 2. Within a few months, almost all the Milchkaus had been destroyed. Unfortunately, Walker himself died shortly afterwards, the victim of a heart attack. Dönitz grasped at the new technologies available to him. He was particularly impressed by the Gnat homing torpedo, which had some success against convoys as early as September 1943. They were particularly effective against escorts until the Allies worked out deception and decoy techniques. Dönitz continued to deploy submarines against convoys, but the loss rates were heavy and the effect decreasing. Intelligence rerouted convoys, and by October U-boats were struggling to find targets. On the 16th of November, Dönitz withdrew the U-boats for a second time. From then until the end of the war, the German submarine became an irritant rather than a threat. In November and December 1943, 72 convoys reached their destinations without the loss of a single ship to submarine attack. American shipyards were completing new cargo ships at the rate of 1 a day. A 10,000-ton Liberty ship could be welded together in 10 days. One was even built in 4. The first ones were unreliable and could even break in half in rough weather. The later ones brought the munitions, the fuel, the food and the weapons that the Allies needed for the invasion of Europe.
Today, the shipyards of North America sound their answer in the clang of hammers. New ships to release British merchantmen for service in the Atlantic. And along Canada's coasts and rivers, the corvettes take the water to help Britain's hard-pressed destroyers keep that vital supply line open. Already the tide of battle may be turning. Already the wide Atlantic is becoming a graveyard for the raiders themselves. Yet the final answer lies not alone in ships. Hitler himself has said, "It is not arms that decide, but the men behind them." And behind these men of Churchill's Island lies 1,000 years of the sea in peace and war, in calm and storm. Because of them, the convoys plow on and Britain's lifeline holds.
The tonnage war had been lost. Within a year, the bases in France were being evacuated, and the losses of U-boats and their accompanying vessels in this operation was little better than carnage. In their last operations in the Baltic, the situation was even worse. 83 U-boats were sunk in the last 5 weeks of the war, almost all to aircraft. On the 4th of May, the second Führer of Nazi Germany, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, ordered all the remaining U-boats to cease operations. 3 days later, the war against Germany formally ended. The surrender was signed by Karl Dönitz. Despite the great hopes of Dönitz, the U-boats did not win the war for the Germans. There were never enough U-boats for the battle. Dönitz and Rieder had agreed that the German Navy would need 300 submarines. By the time they had that number, it was too late, and the battle was lost. The successes of the large packs, however, at the height of the campaign, demonstrated what could have been achieved if the numbers had been there. The escorts could have been completely swamped. The ability of the Allies to build new escorts and merchant ships to replace those sunk had been underestimated. The Germans might have succeeded if the Americans had stayed out of the war, but as soon as they entered and the Liberty ships came rolling down the slipways, the tonnage war was doomed. The Allies also were able to use advances in technology much more quickly. They introduced radar, new detection devices, long-range aircraft, better weapons and better intelligence. The Allies also had luck with the early capture of an Enigma machine. U-boats have since been represented as evil. To the British in 1941, they were the enemy in its worst form, ruthless, determined, and dedicated to a man who was bent on dominating the world. Yet time has mellowed this view. No one today can doubt the bravery of sailors who knew that a lingering death could await them, or that they would die entombed in a steel tube many meters below the sea. Like their victims, they knew also that if they survived an attack, there still remained the sea, the Atlantic. The Third Reich built 1,162 U-boats. 830 took part in operations. 784 were lost. Of the 41,000 men who manned them, almost 26,000 were killed. 5,000, the lucky ones, were captured. 2,828 Allied and neutral merchant ships were sunk, almost 15 million tons. How many died in them will never be known. 30,000 British merchant sailors were killed in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Royal Navy lost 175 warships trying to protect them. 5,880 airmen and 2,000 Canadians died in the same cause. It was vital to the Allies that they won it. If they hadn't, Britain may not have survived to continue the war against the aggressor. The Allies came very close to losing it. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continual battle of the Second World War. It was ferocious and bloody. It is the story of waste on a massive scale. The images are of ships sinking in flames, seamen burning and choking in oil, freezing to death in the Arctic, of magazines exploding, blowing warships to smithereens, of gruesome remains rising to the surface of the sea, of endless cries for help. Many of the battle's victims have no known grave, no headstone to commemorate their last resting place. But they cannot be forgotten.